In the crisp, golden autumn of 2006, the small, idyllic town of Oakhaven, nestled in a valley of whispering pines, lost a piece of its soul. 8-year-old Ethan Hayes, a boy with a constellation of freckles across his nose and a smile that could disarm the sternest of neighbors, vanished without a trace. One moment he was a flash of red, his t-shirt, his new bicycle, pedaling furiously down the lane that bordered the sprawling national forest, and the next he was gone. The initial search was a frantic, desperate mobilization of the entire community. Neighbors linked arms and trudged through the dense undergrowth, their calls of Ethan, growing hoarser and more fearful as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. A young, fiercely determined Detective Miles Corbin led the official investigation, his face a mask of grim focus as he coordinated state troopers and K-9 units. The only tangible clue they found was Ethan's red bicycle, lying on its side near a trailhead, its front wheel still spinning lazily in the breeze as if it had been abandoned only moments before. Beside it, half hidden in the pine needles, was a small, crudely but lovingly carved wooden bird. It was an anomaly, an object with no apparent origin, logged into evidence and quickly forgotten amidst the terrifying lack of anything else. The days bled into weeks. The search grid expanded, then contracted. Theories swirled like the autumn leaves. He had gotten lost, a tragic accident in the unforgiving woods. He had been taken by a transient passing through on the nearby highway. He had run away, though no one who knew the bright, happy child could believe it. Detective Corbin worked himself to the point of collapse, interviewing every resident, chasing down every flimsy lead, his office lights burning long into the night. He spoke to Ethan's parents, the Hayeses, until their raw grief became a permanent fixture in his own memory. He promised them he would find their son. It was a promise that would slowly curdle into his greatest professional and personal failure. The investigation went cold. The yellow police tape came down, the news vans drove away, and the seasons turned. Oakhaven learned to live with the scar, a constant, low-grade ache of a mystery unsolved. The Hayeses' marriage fractured under the immense, unrelenting pressure of their loss. Ethan's father moved away, a hollowed-out man chasing oblivion. His mother, Eleanor, remained, a ghost in her own home, a living monument to a love that had nowhere to go. For 18 years, the file on Ethan Hayes gathered dust on a shelf in Miles Corbin's office, a testament to a promise he couldn't keep. But 18 years later, in a bustling, anonymous city hundreds of miles away, a young man named Leo celebrated his 26th birthday. He had always felt a sense of disconnection, a quiet displacement in his own life. Raised by a stern, emotionally distant woman he knew as Aunt Clara, he was told his parents had died in a car crash when he was very young. With Clara gone for several years now, he was truly alone, navigating the world with a persistent, nagging feeling that a part of his own story was missing. His girlfriend, seeing the quiet melancholy that shadowed his eyes, gifted him an ancestry DNA kit, hoping it might offer him some sense of rootedness, a connection to a past he never knew. He swabbed his cheek, sent off the sample, and mostly forgot about it, not daring to hope for much. Weeks later, an email arrived. The results were in. The confirmation of a life adrift had finally come. Leo clicked the link, a knot of nervous anticipation tightening in his stomach. He scanned the ethnicity estimates, the geographical data, a digital map of a life that felt completely alien to him. Then he saw a different notification, a small, red icon he hadn't noticed before. DNA matches. He navigated to the page. At the very top, under the heading Immediate Family, was a name that meant nothing to him, Eleanor Hayes. Beside the name, in parentheses, was the word that made the world tilt on its axis, mother. It was a mistake. It had to be a mistake. His mother was dead. Her name wasn't Eleanor. He almost closed the browser, a wave of disappointment washing over him. But his curiosity, that lifelong itch of not knowing, compelled him to click on the profile. It was sparse, but it contained a link to a memorial page on a social media site, one dedicated to a missing child. The page was a tapestry of grief and memory, filled with photos of a small, freckle-faced boy with a blindingly familiar smile. The boy was 8 years old. His name was Ethan Hayes. Leo stared at the screen, his own reflection shimmering back at him from the dark glass. The boy in the pictures was him. The same dark, unruly hair, the same shape of the eyes, the same slight gap between his two front teeth. It was like looking at a ghost of himself, a self he had never been allowed to be. A cold dread, sharp and suffocating, seized him. He stumbled back from his desk, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Every story Aunt Clara had told him, every sterile, loveless memory of his childhood, was a lie. He wasn't Leo. He was Ethan. And he hadn't been orphaned, he had been stolen. The ensuing hours were a blur of frantic, disbelieving calls, first to the Ancestry support line, then, with trembling hands, to the non-emergency number for the police department listed on the memorial page. The information, a bombshell wrapped in genetic code, began its slow, bureaucratic journey back to its origin. It trickled from a city precinct to a state-level clearinghouse for missing persons, and finally, to the small, underfunded Oakhaven Police Department. The call reached the desk of Detective Miles Corbin. He was now just months from retirement, a grizzled, weary man whose shoulders stooped with the weight of decades on the force. His office was a cluttered repository of Oakhaven's sorrows, but the Ethan Hayes case file was never on a shelf. It sat on the corner of his desk, its cardboard worn soft from countless times being opened and closed. The phone's shrill ring cut through the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights. Corbin answered, his voice gravelly with fatigue. He listened, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the receiver. The skepticism in his initial responses slowly melted away, replaced by a stunned, electrifying silence. His heart, which he thought had long since become inured to shock, began to pound against his ribs with a force he hadn't felt in years. He hung up the phone, his hand hovering over it as if it were a sacred object. Ethan Hayes was alive. The words echoed in the small, dusty office, a pronouncement that rewrote 18 years of failure and grief. The ghost that had haunted him for nearly 2 decades had just walked back into the world of the living. The news of Ethan Hayes' existence acted like a defibrillator on Miles Corbin's career. The weariness that had settled deep into his bones was burned away by a sudden, ferocious surge of purpose. He strode into the office of the new chief of police, a man 20 years his junior with a fondness for analytics and a barely concealed impatience for the old guard. Corbin didn't request resources, he demanded them. He laid out the stunning new facts with a clarity and passion that left no room for the chief's typical bureaucratic skepticism. For the first time in years, Corbin wasn't a relic recounting a cold case. He was a lead detective on the most important active investigation the town had seen in a generation. The first task, however, was not one of policing but of profound human responsibility. He had to tell Eleanor Hayes. He drove the familiar route to her modest home on the edge of town, the same house where he had once sat delivering hollow words of comfort. The house itself seemed trapped in time, the hedges slightly overgrown, the paint peeling, a physical manifestation of a life stalled by grief. He found her tending to a small garden in the backyard, her movements slow and deliberate. When she saw him, her face, a roadmap of sorrow, tightened with a familiar dread. Cops only came to see her for one reason, and it was never good news. Corbin approached her carefully, his heart aching with the weight of the words he carried. "Eleanor," he began, his voice softer than he intended. "Something's happened. It's about Ethan." He saw the flicker of pained resignation in her eyes, the preparation for another cruel twist of fate. He didn't draw it out. "We've found him," he said simply. "He's alive." The words hung in the still air between them. Eleanor stared at him, unblinking, her gardening trowel slipping from her grasp and clattering onto the stone patio. She didn't cry or gasp. She simply swayed, and Corbin instinctively reached out to steady her arm. He gently guided her inside, to the living room where a gallery of Ethan's photos adorned the mantelpiece. He pulled out his phone and showed her the recent picture of the young man named Leo. She took the phone with a trembling hand, her thumb stroking the screen as if she could feel the face of the man who was her son. A single tear, then another, traced paths through the lines on her cheeks. It was a hope so terrifyingly large she could barely let it in. Back at the station, a new incident room was being hastily assembled. The old evidence boxes from the Hayes case, sealed for nearly 2 decades, were brought up from the climate-controlled storage in the basement. The smell of dust and aging paper filled the air. Corbin snapped on a pair of latex gloves and lifted the lid of the first box. Inside lay the artifacts of a stolen childhood. Photos of the red bicycle, plastic bags containing soil and leaf samples, witness statements typed on what now looked like ancient word processors. And there, in its own small bag, was the carved wooden bird. Corbin picked it up, the wood smooth and light in his palm. For 18 years, it had been a meaningless piece of debris. Now it felt like a key. With Ethan alive, every piece of evidence had to be re-examined not through the lens of a probable homicide, but of a successful, long-term abduction. The entire narrative had been wrong. Ethan hadn't fallen victim to a random act of violence in the woods. Someone had deliberately taken him, hidden him, and built a new life for him founded on a monstrous lie. The question was no longer just what happened to Ethan Hayes, but who had the motive and the means to orchestrate such a crime and keep it secret for so long. The journey to the city was a tense, silent affair. Corbin traveled with a younger, sharper detective named Isabella Rossi, whose specialty was interviewing victims of trauma. They found Leo. He wasn't ready to be Ethan yet, waiting for them in a sterile, featureless interview room at a local precinct. He sat hunched in his chair, his hands clasped so tightly on the metal table that his knuckles were white. He looked young for 26, with a vulnerability in his eyes that spoke of a lifetime of quiet uncertainty. Corbin started gently, his voice a low, calming rumble. He explained who they were, the purpose of their visit, assuring Leo he was in control of the conversation. Rossi remained a quiet, observant presence, creating a space of safety. Leo began to talk, his voice hesitant at first, then gaining a steadier rhythm as he recounted the life he had known. He spoke of Aunt Clara, a woman he described as more of a warden than a guardian. Their home had been a place of strict rules and emotional sterility. Affection was non-existent. Questions about his past, about his deceased parents, were met with sharp rebukes or a cold, dismissive silence. He was told they died in a fiery car crash, a story so horrific it was designed to stop a child from asking any more questions. He had few friends, his childhood spent in quiet solitude. Clara had passed away from a sudden illness 3 years prior, leaving him with a small, run-down house and a profound sense of emptiness. He had no other family, no connections, just the name Leo and a history that felt as thin as paper. "What are your earliest memories, Leo?" Corbin asked, leaning forward slightly. "Anything before Clara?" Leo squeezed his eyes shut, searching the darkness of his own mind. "Fragments," he whispered, "like a broken dream. I remember a room, a dark room, and a smell. The smell of pine and sawdust. It was strong." He paused, a look of confusion on his face. "And a voice. A man's voice. Not angry, just deep. Low. He told me I had to be a good boy. That my new name was Leo. That I had to be very, very quiet, or something bad would happen." The details sent a jolt through Corbin. Sawdust. A man's voice. This wasn't just a woman acting alone. This was a conspiracy. Corbin took a small, sealed evidence bag from his briefcase and placed it on the table. Inside was the carved wooden bird. "Does this mean anything to you?" Leo stared at the small object. His brow furrowed. He didn't speak for a long time. "I don't know," he said finally, though his tone was uncertain. "It makes my hand feel strange. Like I remember holding something just like it. The rough parts, the smooth parts. But it's like a phantom feeling. It's not a real memory. It was enough. It was more than enough. The bird wasn't a random piece of litter. It was a link, a transitional object between his two lives. The entire original theory, the runaway child, the accidental death, had been a complete fabrication. This was a carefully planned abduction. Ethan had been taken, handed off to a woman paid to be his jailer, and spirited away from everything he knew. The investigation now had a new, urgent direction. Find the woman named Clara, and find the man with the deep voice who smelled of sawdust. The search for Aunt Clara became the investigation's central pivot. Back in Oakhaven, Detective Rossi, a wizard with digital breadcrumbs and public records, dove into the digital ether. The name Clara was common, but Leo provided a key detail. She had often complained about the bitter winters and talked about growing up in Oakhaven. Cross-referencing census data, property records, and DMV archives from 18 years ago, Rossi found her. Her full name was Clara Jenkins. She was a spinster with no criminal record and no known family. She had lived a quiet, unremarkable life in Oakhaven until late 2006, when she abruptly sold her small apartment, quit her job, and moved to the city where she would eventually raise Leo. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. The team pulled her employment records next, digging into the life she had left behind. She had worked as a freelance housekeeper and cleaner for several of the wealthier families in town. As Rossi read the list of former employers aloud in the incident room, one name landed with the force of a physical blow. Arthur Blackwood. A cold, heavy feeling settled in Miles Corbin's gut. He remembered Arthur Blackwood all too well. The owner of Blackwood Timber, the largest employer in the county. A man whose family had practically founded Oakhaven. During the search for Ethan, Blackwood had been the very picture of a concerned community leader. He had organized and funded volunteer search parties, offered a substantial reward for any information, and given tearful, compelling interviews to the local news, pleading for the boy's safe return. He had stood beside Corbin at press conferences, a hand on the detective's shoulder, a pillar of civic strength and compassion. The memory now felt sickeningly false. It was too much. Too helpful, too public, too perfect. Corbin's intuition, an old, reliable instrument honed over 30 years of police work, began to scream. There was no logical reason to suspect Arthur Blackwood, a man with a sterling reputation and a seemingly airtight alibi for the day Ethan disappeared. He'd been hosting a charity luncheon. But Clara Jenkins was the link. She had worked for him, and Corbin knew, with a certainty that defied all available evidence, that this was the path. This was the man who smelled of sawdust. He decided it was time to pay a visit to Oakhaven's most respected citizen, not as a suspect, but as a concerned leader being brought up to speed on a miraculous development. He needed to see the man's face when he told him Ethan Hayes was alive. He needed to look into his eyes and see if he could find the lie that had been festering there for 18 years. He wanted to see if the pillar of the community would show even the slightest crack. The drive to Arthur Blackwood's estate was a journey into another world. The road wound through acres of pristine, privately owned forest before opening up to a grand, gated entrance. The house was a sprawling masterpiece of stone and glass, overlooking the valley with an air of regal authority. Corbin felt a grim irony in the fact that the Blackwood Timber Company had made its fortune by felling the very trees that made the region beautiful. Blackwood himself answered the door, a broad, welcoming smile on his handsome, aging face. He was dressed in expensive casual wear, looking every bit the gentleman's squire. "Miles, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Come in," he boomed, ushering Corbin into a cavernous great room with a soaring ceiling and a massive stone fireplace. He listened with rapt attention as Corbin carefully recounted the story of the ancestry test and the discovery of Ethan. Blackwood performed his shock and elation flawlessly. He shook his head in disbelief, his eyes wide. "My God," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's a miracle. An absolute miracle. After all this time, that poor woman, Eleanor. She must be. I can't even imagine." He was smooth, his reactions polished to a high shine. He paced the room, running a hand through his silver hair, playing the part of the astonished philanthropist to perfection. Corbin watched him, his own face a neutral mask of professional duty. He steered the conversation toward the past. "We're trying to piece together the boy's life," Corbin said. "He was raised by a woman named Clara Jenkins. The name mean anything to you?" "We have her down as a former employee." Blackwood paused, tapping his chin thoughtfully. "Clara Jenkins. Jenkins. Yes, I believe so. Quiet woman, wasn't she? Very efficient housekeeper. Kept to herself. This is astonishing. To think she was involved. I just can't fathom it." He then, without being asked, pivoted to offering his help. "Miles, whatever you need. My resources are your resources. A new reward, investigative support, anything. We have to find out who did this to that boy, who put her up to it." The performance was impeccable. So impeccable that it felt rehearsed. As Blackwood spoke, gesturing magnanimously around his opulent room, Corbin's eyes drifted to the large, hand-carved mantelpiece above the fireplace. It was adorned with family photos, civic awards, and a collection of small, exquisitely detailed wooden animals. There was a fox, a bear, a deer. And at the end of the line, almost hidden behind a silver frame, was a bird. It was carved from the same light-colored pine, with the same distinctive knife strokes, the same slightly naive style as the one found beside Ethan's bicycle 18 years ago. The anomaly, the meaningless piece of debris, was now sitting in the villain's living room. A cold wave washed over Corbin, so intense it was almost dizzying. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his expression remained unchanged. He had him. He didn't know how or why, but he was looking at the man. The helpful philanthropist, the concerned citizen, the man who carved little wooden birds, was the monster they had been hunting all along. Corbin finished his coffee, thanked Blackwood for his time and his generous offer, and left. The image of that bird burned into his mind. The hunt had just become personal. The moment Corbin's car cleared the long, winding driveway of the Blackwood estate, he was on the phone to Rossi. "He's our man," he said, his voice tight with a cold fury. "Get a warrant for his financials, phone records, everything you can for the 6 months surrounding the disappearance. And put a quiet tail on him. I don't want him spooked." The investigation kicked into a higher gear, shifting from a search for answers to a focused effort to build an inescapable case against one man. While surveillance teams began discreetly tracking Arthur Blackwood's every move, Corbin and Rossi launched a full-scale assault on the past. They reopened every witness file from 2006, this time with a new, critical question. Where was Arthur Blackwood? They re-interviewed dozens of people, their memories now jogged by the passage of time and the shocking new context. The breakthrough came from an elderly man, a retired postal worker and avid birdwatcher, who had lived on the edge of town near the National Forest. On the day Ethan disappeared, the man had been out with his binoculars. He now recalled, with newfound clarity, seeing a car he recognized, Blackwood's gleaming black Lincoln Town car, a rarity in Oakhaven, parked on a secluded timber service road, a place it had no business being. At the time, he'd assumed Blackwood was inspecting his property and thought nothing more of it. Now the memory was damning. That service road was less than 100 yards from where Ethan's bicycle was found. Simultaneously, Rossi's deep dive into the financials yielded gold. 2 days after Ethan Hayes vanished from Oakhaven, Arthur Blackwood made a cash withdrawal of $50,000 from his personal account, a significant sum, even for him, noted in the bank records as for personal acquisitions. Less than a week later, the financial trail of Clara Jenkins lit up. Having just moved to the city, she made a down payment on a small house and opened a new savings account with an initial deposit of $45,000, all in cash. The numbers didn't lie. It was a clear, undeniable payoff. Blackwood had bought her services and her silence. The pieces were slotting into place with terrifying precision. Blackwood had used his knowledge of the service roads to stage an abduction away from prying eyes. He had paid off his former housekeeper, a lonely woman with no ties, to take the boy and create a new life far away. The unveiling of the conspiracy was methodical, each new piece of evidence peeling back another layer of Blackwood's carefully constructed facade of respectability. He wasn't just a pillar of the community. He was a master manipulator who had used his wealth and reputation as the perfect cover. He had hidden in plain sight, directing the search for a boy he himself had stolen. The public grief, the reward money, the comforting hand on Corbin's shoulder, it was all a grotesque, cynical performance to divert suspicion. The case was solidifying, but one crucial question remained, haunting Corbin's every waking thought. Why? It wasn't for ransom, no demand was ever made. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was cold, calculated, and meticulously planned. Why take an 8-year-old boy? What was Arthur Blackwood's real motive? The answer, Corbin suspected, would be even more monstrous than the crime itself. The question of motive became an obsession for Corbin. Abducting a child and hiding him for 18 years was an act of profound and bizarre criminality that defied easy explanation. Digging into Blackwood's known life offered no clues. He was a celebrated family man, a philanthropist, a business leader. Corbin knew the truth had to lie in the parts of his life he kept hidden. He started by pulling sealed records, calling in old favors with judges and clerks he had known for decades. He found a sealed divorce filing from Blackwood's first marriage, 30 years ago. In it, his ex-wife had made vague but chilling allegations of unnatural proclivities and a darkness he kept hidden, claims that were later withdrawn after a swift and generous settlement. It was a thread. Corbin then turned his attention to Blackwood Timber. He tasked Rossi with finding any former employees who had left the company on bad terms. After several dead ends, she found a man named George Gallo, a former logging foreman fired a decade ago for alleged theft, though Gallo always claimed he was set up after he saw something he shouldn't have. Corbin found Gallo living in a trailer park 2 counties over, a bitter man nursing a long-held grudge. At first, Gallo was reluctant to talk, fearful of Blackwood's power. But Corbin's patient, persistent questioning, and the revelation that this was connected to the Ethan Hayes case, finally broke his silence. Gallo told them about a place deep in the Blackwood timberlands, a secluded, heavily fortified hunting cabin that Blackwood used for private business. It was strictly off-limits to all employees. Gallo, suspecting his boss was hiding profits, once snuck out to the cabin. He didn't find hidden money. He described seeing other cars there, expensive, out-of-state vehicles, and hearing strange things. But one memory stood out, from right around the time the Hayes boy disappeared. Gallo had seen Blackwood meeting with another man at the cabin, a hugely wealthy, politically connected industrialist from out of state. Gallo knew of the man's reputation, a name whispered in darker circles, a man with a known, vile appetite for children. The horrific truth crashed down on Corbin with the force of a physical blow. Blackwood wasn't the primary predator. He was worse. He was a purveyor, a broker of human lives. He had used his power, his land, and his veneer of respectability to facilitate the most depraved of transactions. Ethan Hayes wasn't taken for Blackwood. He was procured for this powerful client. The motive was profit and power, servicing the monstrous desires of another influential man to cement his own business dealings. The memory Leo had of sawdust finally clicked into its terrible place. The cabin was near a small, private milling operation. The man with the deep voice wasn't just a kidnapper. He was a monster showing off his new acquisition. Something must have gone wrong. The intense, national media coverage of Ethan's disappearance, far more than Blackwood could have anticipated, must have spooked the client. The deal fell through. Blackwood was left with a child he couldn't return and couldn't afford to have found. So he improvised. Killing the boy would be messy, risky. A better, more efficient solution was to make him disappear permanently. He activated his backup plan, Clara Jenkins, the lonely, pliable housekeeper who could be bought. The entire 18-year lie was a cover-up for a business transaction gone wrong. With Gallo's testimony providing the probable cause for the cabin's location, Corbin secured the final warrants. He led a heavily armed tactical team into the dense Blackwood forest as dawn broke, the air thick with mist and the smell of pine. They found the cabin exactly where Gallo had described it, a fortress of logs and steel shutters deep within the private woods. The main cabin was Spartan, masculine, smelling of leather and wood smoke. But the true discovery was in the workshop out back. On a workbench sat carving tools, knives, and several blocks of the same light-colored pine as the bird from the crime scene. And behind a false wall, they found a steep staircase leading down to a hidden basement. The room at the bottom was a parent's worst nightmare. It was small, windowless, and soundproofed. A small cot was bolted to the floor. The air was stale with the memory of old fear. A forensics team swept the room, and under the harsh glare of their portable lights, they found it. On the grimy plastic of an old light switch plate, a single, partial fingerprint, perfectly preserved in the dry, still air. They ran it through the system, comparing it to the prints on file from Ethan Hayes' birth certificate records. It was a perfect match. They had him. Corbin didn't wait. He drove straight to Blackwood's corporate headquarters, a sleek tower of glass and steel that loomed over downtown Oakhaven. He found Blackwood in his top-floor office, a space of minimalist white walls and expensive art, looking out over the town he had fooled for so long. Corbin walked in, flanked by two uniformed officers, and calmly told Blackwood he was under arrest for the kidnapping of Ethan Hayes. The philanthropist's mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. But it wasn't fear or panic that replaced it. It was a chilling, reptilian stillness. As Corbin laid out the evidence, piece by damning piece, Clara Jenkins, the $50,000, the witness seeing his car, the identical wooden bird, and finally, the fingerprint in the soundproofed room, Blackwood's expression shifted to one of profound intellectual annoyance. Cornered and exposed, he didn't bother with denial. This was his confession, delivered not with remorse, but with the clinical detachment of a CEO discussing a failed merger. He wasn't supposed to be there, Blackwood said, his voice even, almost conversational. The boy was playing by the service road. It was an opportunity, a business proposition. The bird, children are fools for trinkets. He explained the arrangement with his client with no emotion, as if discussing lumber prices. The media attention became excessive. My associate grew timid. It compromised the arrangement. Disposing of the asset would have been needlessly complicated. Relocating him was the more logical, efficient solution. Clara was indebted to me. She was a simple, clean solution to a logistical problem. There was no guilt, no shame, only the cold, sociopathic irritation that his perfect, 18-year-old solution had finally, illogically, come undone. For Blackwood, Ethan Hayes was never a child. He was an asset, a commodity, a logistical problem. And now, he was a loose end that had finally tightened into a noose. The arrest of Arthur Blackwood sent a seismic shockwave through Oakhaven. The story was a maelstrom of horror and disbelief, the town's most celebrated son revealed as its most depraved monster. The name, Blackwood, once a symbol of prosperity and civic pride, became a mark of shame. The handsome philanthropist on the news was replaced by the mugshot of a man with cold, dead eyes, a villain who had hidden in plain sight, shaking hands and donating to the very community he had so profoundly betrayed. For Miles Corbin, the clamor of the media, and the public fallout was just noise. His focus was on the final, most important piece of the puzzle, closing the circle. The legal system would deal with Blackwood, but justice was more than a conviction. It was about restoring, as much as possible, what had been stolen. The last act of the case was not an interrogation or a raid, but a quiet, fragile reunion. Corbin arranged for Leo, who was now slowly, tentatively beginning to think of himself as Ethan, to meet his mother. There were no cameras, no officials, just Corbin driving Ethan to the small house that had been frozen in time. Eleanor was waiting on the porch, twisting her hands in her apron. Ethan got out of the car and stood on the walkway, a 26-year-old man looking at the home he'd left as an 8-year-old boy. For a long moment, they just stared at each other across the expanse of 18 lost years, a chasm of unspoken words and unimaginable pain. Eleanor took a hesitant step forward, then another. "Ethan," she whispered, the name a prayer on her lips. He gave a small, jerky nod, his own eyes welling up. She closed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around her son, burying her face in his shoulder, her body shaking with the force of a grief finally allowed to break. It wasn't a Hollywood ending. It was something far more real, tentative, painful, and achingly beautiful. It was the first step on a long, uncertain road to healing, a new beginning built from the wreckage of the past. Corbin watched from his car, his heart full. He didn't intrude. This moment belonged to them. He quietly put the car in reverse and drove away, leaving them to their fragile peace. Back in his cluttered office, he picked up the thick, worn file. For nearly 2 decades, its open status had been a symbol of his failure. Now he took a heavy rubber stamp, inked it, and pressed it firmly onto the cover. The word closed appeared in bold red letters. He ran his fingers over the word, a quiet finality settling over him. He looked around the office, at the stacks of files, the ghosts of other cases, other sorrows. But the one ghost that had haunted him the longest was finally at peace. Miles Corbin stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out of his office for the last time. He didn't look back. He walked out into the afternoon sun, a man no longer defined by the case he couldn't solve, but by the one he finally brought home.